I thought I owned my driveway, until Karen showed up with a clipboard, a fake rulebook, and a personal vendetta. She called the cops on me, over my own property. But what she didn't realize, I had the ultimate trump card that would expose her power-hungry antics and bring her reign of terror to a hilarious, karma-filled end. Buckle up because this HOA drama gets insanely petty. Hello beautiful people. Before we dive in, a small click from you can help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Hit that subscribe button and be part of the journey. Let's go. A quiet, peaceful neighborhood. The kind where kids ride their bikes, retirees tend to their gardens, and everyone mostly minds their business. At least that's how it should be. But every neighborhood has one. The self-appointed ruler, the enforcer of imaginary laws, the gatekeeper of suburban perfection. Enter Karen. Karen wasn't just a regular HOA member. No, she was the HOA. Or at least she acted like it. Clipboard in hand, she patrolled the streets with the intensity of a security guard at a top-secret facility. If a mailbox was slightly crooked, if a car was parked at an angle she deemed unacceptable, if a single weed dared to sprout on someone's lawn, Karen was there, ready to hand out citations as if she were issuing parking tickets in a downtown rush-hour zone. For the protagonist, a laid-back, reasonable homeowner, the first encounter with Karen was almost laughable. She had approached with a frown so deep it looked permanent, clutching a printed sheet of violations. The offense? A garden gnome. Not an army of them. Not a flashing neon sign that said, "Welcome to Gnomeville." Just one small, harmless garden gnome. That's not HOA approved, she huffed as if the gnome had personally insulted her sense of decorum. The protagonist, amused but polite, pointed out that nothing in the HOA guidelines prohibited garden decorations. But Karen was undeterred. She had her own interpretation of the rules, ones that she seemingly made up on the spot. And from that moment on, it was clear that life in this neighborhood was about to get a whole lot more complicated. Because when Karen sets her sights on someone, she doesn't let go. Karen wasted no time establishing her authority, or at least the authority she imagined she had. While most HOA boards operated with some level of formality, Karen seemed to believe she alone had the power to dictate every detail of the neighborhood. She acted as if she had been elected by unanimous vote, when in reality, no one even remembered her ever being officially part of the HOA leadership. That didn't stop her from strutting through the cul-de-sac like a self-appointed sheriff, enforcing rules no one had ever heard of. The first real confrontation happened over something so trivial, it was almost impressive. The protagonist had parked their car in their own driveway as any reasonable homeowner would. But not in Karen's world. That's against HOA policy, she announced one morning, standing at the edge of the driveway with her ever-present clipboard. The protagonist, sipping coffee on the porch, raised an eyebrow. "What is parking in your driveway overnight?" she said as if reading from an invisible rulebook. There was a beat of silence before the inevitable response. "That's not a rule." Karen pursed her lips. "Well, it should be. It disrupts the visual harmony of the neighborhood." Visual harmony? Yes. It creates clutter. And we strive for a clean, uniform aesthetic. The protagonist looked around. Other neighbors had cars parked in their driveways too. Karen, of course, ignored this detail. She was laser-focused on her target. "Well, until it actually becomes a rule, I'll keep parking in my own driveway." That should have been the end of it. Any reasonable person would have dropped it, realizing they had no real power to enforce such nonsense. But Karen was not a reasonable person. She wasn't even close. The next morning, a printed violation notice was taped to the protagonist's front door. The bold red letters made it look like an official legal document, but a closer inspection revealed it was nothing more than something Karen had typed up in Microsoft Word, complete with an HOA logo she had probably copied and pasted from Google. "Immediate action required. Your vehicle is in violation of HOA policy." It went on to list imaginary infractions, citing an obstruction of community aesthetics and an unauthorized long-term parking arrangement. The most absurd part? A handwritten note at the bottom that read, "Failure to comply may result in further action including fines." Fines? Karen had no authority to issue fines. She wasn't the HOA president. She wasn't even a board member. But that didn't stop her from acting as if she held absolute power over the neighborhood. The protagonist, amused but increasingly irritated, decided to play along. They took the notice, folded it neatly and placed it in the trash. If Karen wanted to pretend she was running a dictatorship, she would have to find a new victim because this wasn't going to work. But Karen wasn't done. If anything, the lack of response only fueled her determination. Later that week, she returned with reinforcements, a measuring tape and a camera. The protagonist watched from the porch as she crouched down to measure the length of the grass along the edge of the driveway. After taking several dramatic photos, she stood up, hands on her hips, and muttered something about non-compliant lawn maintenance. As if that wasn't ridiculous enough, the next day she escalated to an even more absurd level. She actually tried to police the color of the protagonist's front door. "Your door is too dark," she declared. The protagonist blinked. "Too dark?" "Yes. It disrupts the flow of the street's color scheme. It's navy blue." "Well, the HOA prefers lighter colors." "No, you prefer lighter colors." Karen scoffed as if the distinction didn't matter. She pointed to yet another piece of paper in her hand, ready to tape it to the door like an official summons. By now the pattern was clear. Karen wasn't enforcing real rules, she was making them up as she went along. And she wasn't going to stop until she got what she wanted. What she didn't realize was that she had just picked a fight with the wrong person. At first, the best course of action seemed to be ignoring Karen. After all, what harm could she really do? She wasn't actually in charge. She wasn't the HOA president. She didn't have any real authority. But what she lacked in power she made up for in sheer persistence. The notices kept coming, each more ridiculous than the last. One day, it was a warning about a non-regulation mailbox height, despite being the same height as every other mailbox on the street. The next, it was a complaint about excessively decorative patio furniture. Then came a particularly baffling one, an official-looking citation accusing the protagonist of allowing their lawn to be too green. Not overgrown. Not patchy. Just too green. Clearly, Karen had no intention of letting this go. But if she expected intimidation to work, she had miscalculated. Rather than engage in a full-blown confrontation, the protagonist decided on a different approach. Petty compliance, following Karen's ridiculous demands to the letter, but in ways that would drive her absolutely insane. The first move was with the car. Since Karen insisted driveway parking was against policy, the protagonist started parking on the street, right in front of her house. Perfectly legal. Perfectly within the real HOA rules. And perfectly positioned to make Karen seethe every time she looked outside. Next came the mailbox. Since the alleged violation was about height, the protagonist made a minor adjustment, by adding an inch-tall decorative base. It wasn't noticeable to anyone else, but to Karen, it was an outright declaration of war. She spent a full afternoon standing outside with a ruler, measuring the mailbox, muttering under her breath, and taking pictures for her ever-growing collection of evidence. But the real masterpiece was the door color situation. Since Karen had declared it too dark, the protagonist decided to test just how far she was willing to go. Instead of repainting it, they added a temporary banner, a giant neon pink "Welcome to the Neighborhood" sign, complete with glittery accents and an oversized cartoon smiley face. Karen nearly had a stroke. She stormed over immediately, looking more flustered than ever. This is unacceptable," she sputtered, waving her clipboard like a battle flag. "You said the door was too dark," the protagonist replied innocently. "So I added some brightness. This is vandalism against the aesthetic of the community. It's temporary. HOA rules don't say anything about temporary decorations." Karen's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. For the first time she seemed at a loss for words. But of course Karen wasn't the type to admit defeat. She took a step back, narrowed her eyes and muttered, "We'll see about that." And with that she marched off, undoubtedly plotting her next move. The protagonist couldn't help but smile. If Karen wanted a battle, she was about to get one. Word spread quickly. It always did in neighborhoods like this. By the end of the week, half the cul-de-sac knew about Karen's ongoing crusade, and the reactions were mixed. Some neighbors pretended not to notice, keeping their heads down and avoiding the drama at all costs. Others were quietly amused, exchanging knowing glances whenever Karen launched into another one of her self-important tirades. And then there were the ones who had their own stories, horror stories really, about their past run-ins with Karen. Tom from next door was the first to speak up. She accused my cat of trespassing, he said in a hushed voice as if Karen had the street wired for sound. The cat? Yeah. She told me I needed to keep him on a leash if he was going to wander the neighborhood unsupervised. Another neighbor, an older woman named Barbara, chimed in. She tried to fine me last Christmas for putting up a wreath before Thanksgiving. Said it was out of season and disrupted the neighborhood's visual flow. She told me my front yard was too cluttered because I had more than 3 flower pots, someone else added. It was becoming clear that Karen wasn't just a nuisance. She was a full-blown neighborhood menace. The only difference now was that for the first time, someone was standing up to her. A few neighbors found the whole thing so entertaining that they began to subtly push Karen's buttons in their own ways. Tom, emboldened by the protagonist's defiance, put up an extra garden gnome just to see what would happen. Another neighbor left his trash cans at the curb an hour later than usual, just to watch Karen pace up and down the street in barely contained fury. Then came the rumors. Someone claimed they had seen Karen out late at night, patrolling the sidewalks with a flashlight, searching for the next violation to add to her growing list. Another said she had a binder labeled Neighborhood Offenders, where she kept records of every infraction she had ever encountered. No one could confirm if it was true, but it wasn't exactly hard to believe. One evening, a small group gathered on the protagonist's driveway, exchanging stories and theories like suburban detectives piecing together the case of Karen versus everyone. It was half comedy, half support group, but it was clear that the neighborhood was beginning to unite against their common enemy. She's gonna snap, Tom predicted. There's no way she's letting this go. He wasn't wrong. Because while the neighbors were enjoying the show, Karen was preparing for her biggest power move yet. Karen had officially lost control and everyone knew it except for her. The more she tried to tighten her grip on the neighborhood, the more things slipped through her fingers. The petty citations weren't working. The protagonist wasn't backing down. The neighbors were openly mocking her. But instead of cutting her losses, she doubled down. First, she escalated from passive-aggressive notices to outright surveillance. She started taking pictures of violations from across the street, sometimes even standing in the middle of people's yards to get a better angle. She was seen lurking behind bushes, notebook in hand, scribbling down offenses in real time. Then the unthinkable happened. She called the cops. It was a Saturday morning when the police car rolled up in front of the protagonist's house. A few neighbors peeked through their curtains, while the braver ones stepped outside, already sensing the absurdity that was about to unfold. The officer, looking far too tired for whatever nonsense he had just been called into, walked up to the house. "Are you the homeowner?" "Yes." "What's this about?" The officer sighed. "Your neighbor reported an illegal vehicle parked on the property." The protagonist blinked. "You mean my car?" "That's what I asked her. She said it's in violation of HOA regulations." "And what did you tell her?" "That the HOA doesn't have jurisdiction over privately owned driveways. And that this is a complete waste of police resources." By now, Karen had marched over, standing with her arms crossed. "This is unacceptable. The car is ruining the look of the neighborhood." The officer turned to her. "Ma'am, unless this vehicle is stolen, blocking a fire hydrant, or violating a local ordinance, there's nothing illegal about it being here." "But it's an eyesore." "That's not a crime." Karen's mouth opened, then closed, her face turning red. It was possibly the first time someone with actual authority had shut her down so bluntly. The officer gave the protagonist an apologetic nod before heading back to his car. As he pulled away, Karen stood frozen, humiliated, her entire face a storm of frustration. The neighborhood had seen everything. The whispers started immediately. After that, things unraveled quickly. The protagonist decided it was time to put an end to Karen's reign of terror once and for all. It started with gathering evidence. Every ridiculous complaint, every violation notice, every instance of Karen overstepping her non-existent authority. The neighbors contributed their own grievances, some even producing security footage of Karen sneaking onto properties to inspect supposed infractions. Then came the HOA meeting. Normally, these meetings were sparsely attended, but this time, nearly the entire neighborhood showed up. Karen arrived with her ever-present clipboard, convinced she was about to lecture the group into submission. But she wasn't prepared for what came next. One by one, neighbors began to speak up. "She harassed me about my garden gnome. She called the cops over a parked car. She tried to fine me for my own cat being outside. She's been trespassing on people's properties. Then the bombshell. The protagonist revealed the compiled evidence. The photos, the fake notices, the sheer absurdity of Karen's self-made rules. The HOA board, which had mostly tolerated her antics up until this point, couldn't ignore it any longer. The final blow came when the HOA president spoke. Karen, you don't actually hold any authority within this association. And based on the overwhelming complaints, I'm recommending that you be removed from any future HOA involvement. Effective immediately. It was over. Karen sat there, speechless for the first time as the room erupted into murmurs of approval. The neighbors, who had endured years of her nonsense, exchanged triumphant glances. And just like that, Karen's reign ended, not with a dramatic exit, not with a fight, but with the one thing she had never been able to handle, being ignored. With Karen effectively dethroned, the neighborhood seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. Almost overnight things changed. The suffocating fear of receiving a bogus violation notice vanished. People started leaving their trash cans out a little longer, parking in their own driveways without worry, and even, gasp, putting up garden gnomes in broad daylight. The best part? Karen had to live with it. For the first time she was the one receiving notices, real ones from the actual HOA board. The same mailbox she had criticized others for? Turns out hers wasn't up to code. The car she was so concerned about? She now had to deal with multiple cars parked in front of her house because, suddenly, street parking had become a neighborhood-wide trend. And that meticulously measured grass she had been so obsessed with? Someone on the board decided it was time for a re-evaluation of landscaping standards. And guess whose lawn needed adjustments to comply? The final blow came when the HOA issued an official statement clarifying that Karen had never actually held any authority within the association. It was posted publicly for all to see, and the neighbors had an absolute field day with it. A few even made copies and discreetly taped them to community bulletin boards. Karen tried for a while to maintain her old routine. She still walked the neighborhood with her clipboard, still glared disapprovingly at people's houses, still acted like she was in charge. But it wasn't the same. The power was gone. The real turning point came when holiday season rolled around. 4 years, Karen had kept the decorations in check, making sure nothing excessive or gaudy disrupted the uniform aesthetic of the neighborhood. But this year, the lights went up earlier, bigger and brighter than ever before. The protagonist and a few other neighbors led the charge, hanging oversized decorations, setting up synchronized light displays, and even organizing a most festive house competition. Karen could do nothing but watch as her once pristine regulation-bound neighborhood transformed into a dazzling, chaotic celebration of everything she had fought against. And then, as if the universe had a sense of humor, the HOA president personally delivered her first official violation notice. Her own wreath didn't meet updated community guidelines. The look on her face was priceless. Not long after that, the for sale sign appeared in Karen's yard. She held out for a while, refusing to admit defeat, but it was clear, she had lost. She had spent years trying to control the neighborhood, only to end up completely powerless in it. When she finally moved away, the celebration was subtle but undeniable. People joked about throwing a block party, but in the end the best revenge was simply enjoying their newfound freedom. The protagonist stood on the porch, watching as the moving truck pulled away, taking Karen and her clipboard with it. The grass grew freely. The mailboxes stood proudly uninspected. And best of all, a new gnome sat happily in the front yard, welcoming a Karen-free future. Life in the neighborhood settled into a new, relaxed normal after Karen's departure. Without her constant interference, people started enjoying their homes in a way they hadn't in years. Driveways filled with cars without fear of a bogus citation, kids played freely on the sidewalks without being scolded, and neighbors actually took the time to talk to each other instead of exchanging hushed complaints about the HOA tyrant. The protagonist took a walk one evening, marveling at how much lighter the air felt. The once tense community now had an easy camaraderie, bonded by their shared battle against suburban tyranny. Tom had added 3 more garden gnomes to his yard just for fun, and Barbara had finally put up the oversized holiday wreath she'd been waiting years to display. At the next HOA meeting, people showed up, not out of fear of Karen's antics, but because they actually wanted to discuss real neighborhood concerns. It turned out that without her micromanaging every little thing, the HOA functioned just fine. Maybe even better. Rumors about where Karen had gone varied. Some said she had moved to another HOA-controlled community, destined to repeat her cycle of self-appointed rulemaking. Others joked that she had probably started an online petition to create a national HOA authority. No one knew for sure, and frankly no one cared. Standing on the porch, coffee in hand, the protagonist took in the peaceful sight of a Karen-free street. The grass was a little longer, the decorations a little brighter, and the neighbors a whole lot happier. It was the perfect ending to a ridiculous chapter of suburban life. And just to commemorate the moment, the protagonist walked down to the garden and adjusted the little gnome sitting by the front walkway. For once it could sit there undisturbed.